The first time I noticed Mark, he was sitting alone in the break room, eating a sandwich that looked like it had been packed with more care than any of us had time for. He never said much. In fact, he didn't say anything at all. At first, I assumed he was shy, but then I realized it wasn't shyness. It was silence. Complete silence. Mark couldn't speak. In an office full of people who prided themselves on quick meetings and even quicker jokes, Mark was an easy target. He communicated with gestures, with a small notebook he carried, and sometimes with the kind of expressive eyes you only notice if you slow down long enough to really look at a person. Most people didn't slow down. They made their little comments. They assumed things. And worst of all, they pretended not to hear him when he tried to contribute. I remember one particular afternoon. A team discussion got heated, and Mark wrote something down and slid the page forward. One of my colleagues glanced at it, smirked, and tossed it aside like it didn't matter. Something inside me twisted. I could see Mark's hand freeze in midair, his face turning red as he quickly pulled the paper back. And before I even realized what I was doing, I spoke up. "Wait a second," I said, louder than I meant to. "He's trying to say something. At least have the decency to read it." The room went quiet. You could have heard the hum of the vending machine. That moment, small as it might seem, was the start of something I couldn't have predicted. Defending him wasn't just about kindness. It was about fairness, about dignity. But little did I know, standing up for Mark that day would eventually put me in front of HR, facing questions I never expected. And as I sat there, much later, in that stiff-backed chair across from the HR manager, I found myself wondering, had I done the right thing, or had I just stepped into a trap carefully laid by someone else? Because sometimes, defending another person doesn't just test your courage, it tests your whole sense of who you are. Before all this, my life at the company was quiet, predictable, almost comfortable. I'd been there for nearly 6 years, long enough to know who ordered too many lattes, who always left meetings late, and who loved to gossip in the elevator. I wasn't ambitious in the cutthroat sense. My goal was steady work, fair pay, and getting home in time for dinner with my wife and kids. Our office wasn't fancy, but it had its own pecking order. The ones with sharp suits and sharper tongues were always at the top of the food chain. The rest of us, steady, hardworking, but less flashy, tended to stay in the background. And then there was Mark. He arrived about 6 months before the incident. Nobody really introduced him properly, and because he didn't talk, most people didn't bother to learn about him. I noticed small details, the careful way he organized his desk, the way he carried his lunch in a tin box that looked older than him, the scarf he always wore even when the office heating was turned up too high. That scarf, it was faded blue with frayed edges, became a kind of signature. Something about it stuck with me. At first, I didn't think much about him. He nodded politely whenever we crossed paths, wrote short notes when he needed help with something, and kept mostly to himself. But slowly, I realized his silence wasn't just about words. It made people uncomfortable, and when people are uncomfortable, they either avoid or they mock. Sadly, in our office, mocking came easier. It started subtly, little jokes whispered behind his back, exaggerated gestures imitating his notebook scribbles. Then it escalated. His ideas ignored in meetings, his work credited to others, and once, his scarf snatched off his chair and dangled like a joke in the middle of the break room. I'll never forget the way he just stood there, frozen, before quietly picking it up and putting it back around his neck. No anger, no complaint, just silence. That silence burned me more than shouting ever could. I kept asking myself, how long could a man endure that without breaking? And more importantly, how long could I keep watching it without saying something? Because sometimes, silence isn't peace. It's the heaviest burden in the room. The breaking point came during a quarterly team meeting. These meetings were supposed to be about performance reviews and future projects, but everyone knew they were more about posturing. People jostled for attention, spoke over each other, and treated every question like an audition for a promotion. Mark sat quietly, notebook open, pen in hand. He always came prepared, and I often caught him jotting down points faster than anyone else. That day, the manager asked for ideas on improving client communication. Mark immediately started writing. His hand moved quickly across the page, and when he was done, he pushed the notebook forward toward the manager. But before the manager could read it, one of my coworkers, Trevor, the loudest voice in any room, snatched the notebook. He scanned the page, laughed, and said, "What is this poetry class? before tossing it back across the table. A few people chuckled nervously, not because it was funny, but because Trevor was the kind of man people laughed with just to stay safe. I felt my jaw tighten. Mark lowered his eyes, fingers gripping that faded blue scarf around his neck like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. That's when something in me snapped. "Read it," I said, my voice firmer this time. "You might learn something." The room went quiet. The manager cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. He looked at Mark's notebook, then at me, then finally said, "All right, let's see." He read the idea aloud, and to everyone's surprise, it was brilliant, concise, innovative, exactly what we needed. There was a shift in the room, but not the kind I'd hoped for. Some nodded, impressed. Others, Trevor especially, looked irritated, like I'd broken an unspoken rule. And in a way, I had. Because in that office, the rule wasn't about talent or contribution. The rule was about hierarchy. Speak only if you have the right standing. Don't challenge the voices that dominate. And never, ever change the script that keeps people comfortable. By defending Mark, I had broken that rule. And once you break it, the test begins. Sometimes, the real test isn't whether you can stand up for someone. It's whether you can endure the consequences of doing so. After that meeting, something shifted, not just with Mark, but with the entire office. For the first time, people began to notice him. Some treated him with polite curiosity, asking him questions they'd never bothered with before, waiting as he scribbled his answers. Others, though, weren't so generous. Trevor in particular seemed to make it his mission to undermine Mark, and by extension me. He began throwing sly comments my way. "Guess you're his translator now," he'd sneer when Mark handed me a note. Or worse, "Careful, if he gets promoted, maybe you'll carry his notebook like a briefcase." He wanted me embarrassed, cornered, silenced. But the thing was, once I defended Mark, I couldn't unsee the way he was treated. I noticed more details now. How he lingered near the window at lunch, where the light caught the dust like falling snow. How he'd quietly pass me a note with a dry, clever joke, proof he had a sense of humor sharper than most of us in the room. How his scarf wasn't just an accessory, but something he touched when he was nervous, almost like a shield. One afternoon, he slid a folded page across my desk. It wasn't about work. It said, "Thank you for standing up for me." Most people pretend not to notice. You noticed. That note meant more than I could explain. It wasn't just gratitude, it was trust. And with trust comes responsibility. But responsibility has a way of complicating things. Because the more I defended him, the more others began to watch me too. Suddenly, small things became puzzles I had to solve. Why did Trevor seem to know when Mark and I were working late? Why did files Mark submitted suddenly go missing, only to reappear once deadlines had passed? And why did the manager, who once seemed indifferent, now avoid eye contact whenever I tried to bring these problems up? It was as if the office itself had turned into a maze, with invisible walls and traps. Mark was at the center of it, but somehow, I was being pulled deeper in too. And every maze has its puzzles, the kind where the answer isn't what you expect, and the cost of solving them might be higher than you're ready to pay. The moment of revelation didn't arrive in a burst. It crept in slowly, like a draft you don't notice until it chills the whole room. It was late on a Friday, the kind of evening when the office emptied out fast. I stayed behind to finish reports, and Mark was still there, tidying his desk with his usual precision. I was about to say goodbye when I noticed something odd. His scarf wasn't around his neck. It was folded neatly on the desk, beside his tin lunchbox. Without it, he looked exposed, almost fragile. Then I saw the papers tucked inside the lunchbox. They weren't food wrappers. They were pages of neatly written notes, sketches, and diagrams, ideas for projects, improvements, even entire strategies. Far more detailed than anything our department had ever produced. I must have looked stunned, because Mark noticed and, after a moment's hesitation, handed me one of the sheets. His handwriting was careful, the kind of script you only develop when writing is your lifeline. The plan I read was so sharp, so innovative, I almost laughed out loud. This wasn't the work of a timid employee. This was genius. When I looked back at him, Mark shook his head and wrote quickly on his notebook. "No one listens. They don't want it from me." That sentence hit harder than any insult Trevor had ever thrown. Here was a man with ideas that could transform our department, maybe even the company itself, and yet he had been silenced, not by his lack of speech, but by the arrogance of those who refused to hear. I realized then, Mark wasn't just surviving in silence. He was carrying brilliance in silence. But brilliance like that doesn't stay hidden forever. And if I knew it, others might have suspected too. Which explained the missing files. The dismissive manager. The way Trevor's eyes burned when Mark's idea was finally acknowledged in the meeting. This wasn't just workplace teasing. This was sabotage. And it wasn't only about Mark anymore. By stepping in, by defending him, I had walked straight into the middle of something bigger, something dangerous. I remember thinking, with a strange mix of fear and resolve, the real story wasn't about what Mark couldn't say. It was about what everyone else didn't want him to say. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't silence. It's truth, waiting to be heard. After that night, I couldn't go back to pretending. Knowing what Mark carried inside those pages made every meeting feel different, charged. Whenever he quietly pushed a note forward, I saw not just a scribble, but the spark of something revolutionary. And I also saw the shadows tightening around him. The office seemed to sense it too. The air changed. Little things started happening, the kind of things you'd dismiss if you weren't paying attention. Mark's computer froze more often than anyone else's. Drafts he'd saved mysteriously disappeared. Once, his scarf went missing for an entire day, only to reappear crumpled in the lost and found. I could tell by the way he held it afterward, smoothing out the fabric, that it wasn't just cloth, it was his anchor. Trevor, meanwhile, grew bolder. He'd crack jokes about Scribble Boy whenever the manager wasn't listening. When I stepped in, Trevor would smirk and say, "Careful, hero. You'll get yourself in trouble defending him." His tone was mocking, but there was something underneath, something sharper. A warning. Then came the incident that truly unsettled me. I was leaving late one evening when I passed the small conference room. Through the glass wall, I saw Trevor and our manager huddled together. Trevor was holding one of Mark's pages, the distinctive, careful handwriting unmistakable even from a distance. I froze. They weren't supposed to have those notes. Mark always kept them close, tucked away. I stayed just long enough to hear a fragment. Trevor's voice, low and deliberate. "We can't let this look like his idea. If it leaks, it's ours." Understood. I slipped away before they noticed me, heart pounding. It wasn't office politics anymore. It was theft. They were stealing his work, his voice, the one he didn't have words to defend. The next day, I tried to warn Mark. He listened, eyes dark, scarf wrapped tight around his neck. He wrote on his notebook, "If you speak up, they'll turn it on you. Be careful." And he was right. Because not even a week later, I got the email, "Please come to HR at 3 p.m. We need to discuss a concern." I stared at it, knowing without doubt, whatever game was being played, I was now a piece on the board. Sometimes, the closer you get to the truth, the closer the walls close in. Walking into HR felt like stepping onto a stage where I hadn't been given a script. The room was sterile, the blinds drawn tight, the air faintly smelling of coffee that had been sitting too long. Across the table sat the HR manager, a woman I'd only spoken to in passing before. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her pen was already poised above a notepad. "Thank you for coming in," she began. "We've had some concerns raised about certain behaviors in your department." Her words were vague, but the weight behind them was not. My stomach tightened. "What kind of concerns?" She glanced at her notes. "Comments have been made that you've been creating division, that you're favoring certain employees, and in doing so, undermining teamwork. We need to understand your perspective." Division. Favoring. The words landed like stones. I knew instantly who was behind them. Trevor. Maybe the manager too. They were framing my defense of Mark as a problem, twisting my integrity into something suspect. I took a slow breath and explained. I told her about the meetings, about the way Mark's ideas were dismissed. I told her how others mocked him, how his work had mysteriously disappeared, how his notes had been ignored. The HR manager listened, nodding occasionally, her pen scratching softly. But then she looked up with that practiced HR calm and asked, "Do you have evidence of this?" Something concrete. Evidence. That was the word that broke me. Because the truth was, most of what I had were moments, stolen glances, overheard whispers, a scarf that disappeared. They weren't the kind of things you could put in a report without sounding paranoid. And then she asked the question that cut deepest. "Is it possible that your empathy for Mark is clouding your judgment?" For a moment, I was speechless. Empathy, as if it were a flaw, as if caring about dignity was some kind of liability. I wanted to shout, To tell her about the night I saw Trevor holding those stolen notes, about the genius hidden inside Mark's lunchbox. But Mark's warning echoed in my mind. If you speak up, they'll turn it on you. So I sat there, steadying myself, and finally said, the only thing clouding this office is the refusal to listen to someone who can't speak. That's the division, not me. The HR manager blinked, surprised by my tone, but she didn't argue. She only said, we'll take this under review. As I left the office, I realized I hadn't just defended Mark anymore. I had drawn a line in the sand. And people like Trevor didn't forgive lines, they crossed them. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones you fight for yourself, but the ones you fight knowing they'll put you directly in the fire. The days after my HR meeting were tense, like walking through an office that no longer belonged to me. Conversations hushed when I entered. Emails I used to receive stopped landing in my inbox. Even Trevor, usually brash and loud, now watched me with a quiet smirk, as though he knew he'd set the trap and was waiting for me to fall through. But then, something unexpected happened. One morning, as I was pouring coffee, Mark approached. He placed his scarf on the counter between us, neatly folded, the way he always kept it. For a second, I thought he was simply resting it there. But then he pushed it gently toward me. Confused, I looked up. He scribbled on his notebook, hold on to it. You'll need it more than me. I didn't understand, until later that afternoon. The company held a quarterly review where leadership announced upcoming projects. To everyone's shock, one of the flagship proposals being presented was word for word identical to what I'd seen in Mark's hidden pages. I glanced at him across the room. His face was calm, almost resigned. Trevor and our manager stood proudly at the front, taking credit. My chest tightened. This was theft in plain sight. And yet, in the silence of that moment, I remembered the scarf folded in my bag. A gesture, a passing of trust. It was as though Mark had handed me his voice. So I stood. Excuse me, I said, louder than I felt. Before we move on, I think the company deserves to know where that idea actually came from. The room shifted. Eyes turned. Trevor froze. The manager's smile faltered. And I told them, not in anger, but in calm, steady detail, about the notes, the missing files, the dismissive laughter, and the brilliance hidden in plain sight. I placed one of Mark's original pages, the copy he had quietly slipped into my bag days before, on the conference table. The handwriting spoke for itself. The silence that followed was heavy, but this time it wasn't Mark's silence. It was the silence of truth revealed. HR investigated. The outcome wasn't immediate, but the tide turned. Trevor was quietly moved out. The manager lost credibility. And Mark, finally, was acknowledged. Not with applause or a standing ovation, but with something far better, respect. A seat at the table. His ideas presented under his name. As for me, I didn't get a promotion, nor did I expect one. But something deeper settled inside me, a legacy of sorts. Mark still wore his scarf, but from then on, whenever he touched it, I saw not just defense, but strength. And in my own way, holding on to that moment, I realized I had found strength too. Because sometimes the legacy you leave isn't in titles or recognition, but in proving that integrity still has a place in a world eager to overlook it. And once you've stood for what's right, no one, not even HR, can take that away. Life at the office never returned to exactly how it had been before, and maybe that was a good thing. Trevor was gone, the manager quieter and more cautious, and HR more attentive than they'd ever been. Mark still wrote in his notebook, still wore that faded blue scarf, but there was a difference in the way people treated him. His silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. People waited when he wrote something down. They listened. And me? I learned something I didn't expect. I'd gone into this believing I was helping him, protecting him. But the truth is, Mark had given me just as much. His courage to keep showing up each day despite everything. His refusal to let silence define his worth had reminded me what integrity really looks like. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It just endures, steady and unshaken, until the truth has no choice but to be seen. Sometimes I still think about the day he placed that scarf in my hands. It wasn't just fabric. It was trust, responsibility, and a quiet passing of strength. I don't carry the scarf with me anymore. It's his, and it belongs around his shoulders, but the lesson it carried has never left my heart. If you've ever been in a position to defend someone, you'll know it isn't easy. It will cost you comfort, sometimes even reputation. But what you gain is something no promotion can buy. The knowledge that you stood on the side of dignity when it mattered most. So here's my thought, one I hold close. The world doesn't change because of grand speeches or titles alone. It changes because ordinary people decide not to stay silent when silence becomes cruelty. And maybe, just maybe, the person you defend will end up being the one who teaches you how to live with a little more courage. Because at the end of the day, kindness is never wasted, and integrity always leaves a legacy.